I'd like to introduce David McLaren, and David is going to be giving his presentation today on precarious work environments within the local areas of Grey Bruce, whichever way we want to say it now. So please welcome David McLaren.
Well, this is going to be a little bit about Grey Bruce, but I take a kind of a macroeconomic view of things, and so you'll see some slides and other things, kind of look at the shape of stuff. I worked for a little while with the Ministry of Health, and since we're in the public health unit, I thought I would mention that. When I was there, I did a lot of work in the research department. We talked a lot about nurse practitioners. And I understand that that's still something that people are considering. And back then, that's a long time ago, I thought it was a done deal, quite frankly. I thought they were a great idea. The other thing I did in the Ministry of Health was help set up district health councils. And they're the precursors of the LIMS. So if you need somebody to blame about the LIMS, I'm here for you. The rest is the arts industry, the private sector, NGOs, a lot of environmental work I've done. And First Nations, speaking of scarcity, First Nations for 20 years. I'm 1/3 of the wise guys, and that's simply a bunch of 3 guys who get on the radio every once in a while with Bill Murdoch, and we pretend that we know what we're talking about, and people phone in and say, yes, in fact, you do know what you're talking about, which is nice. I'm doing some writing for Sun Media, and on the table there, that on the way out, there's a copy of an article that was in the forum on Monday, I guess it was, and this article went across Ontario. It's about getting to a living wage. I'm doing some work, and this is really under the auspices of Peace and Justice. And Peace and Justice is a non-partisan group. We have people there who are orange, we have people there who are blue, we have people there who are red. Well, the blues aren't really blue, they're sort of red Tories, I guess. And I'm not sure that counts in this area, but nevertheless, we have people from all different parties and all different points of view, and we are very concerned about precarious work as it impacts people in this area, as it impacts people in the province and in the country and in other nations as well. One of the things that we did in order to raise consciousness about precarious work was have a number of, we've already done one yet, but we're going to have another one, a briefing for candidates. And we had one in Owen Sound a week or so ago. Are there any candidates here for municipal office? Or did they all run? So you didn't come to our one in Owen Sound and you thought you could escape, but here I am. And for those folks, and for anybody else too, also on that table that leads on the way out is a briefing for a backgrounder on precarious work. And so many of the references in tables, etc., that I'll be showing today are there. So please pick one up on your way out. I guess one of the things I did, I kind of started talking about all of this in the media about 2, maybe 3 years ago. And for a while I held cafe conversations. I would just phone people up and say, you want to come out and we'll talk about some of these things. And we didn't get a lot of people, but we did get some people who were in precarious work. And I have to tell you that we had to stop our presentations, we had to stop our conversation we were having with these folks a number of times because of the emotion. People who don't have a lot of money, people who have a scarcity of money, and really that's the way I like to talk about poverty. I don't like to use the word poverty, although you'll see it on the slides. I much rather talk about scarcity. Because when you have a scarcity of something, whether it's money, or whether it's love, or whether it's friendship, or whether it's a car, that begins to colonize your mind, and you can think of nothing else about how to fill that scarcity. And there's a really good book out called Scarcity, Why Having So Little Matters So Much. I really recommend it. It's an easy read, but the researchers have done a great job in pulling together studies from all over the world as to what happens when you have a scarcity of anything, but particularly a scarcity of money. It's a much more intelligent way of thinking and talking and acting on poverty than falling into the traps that Deidre had already mentioned so well in our biases about poverty. So here's the thing. Canada has the 3rd highest rate of working age poverty among many of our peer countries. The third highest rate. We're only beat by Japan and the US. Next slide. Now, why is this happening? Well, mostly because, and it was mentioned, Deidre mentioned this as well, that the economy has shifted from a manufacturing base to a service base. So Deidre's from Hamilton, Niagara, and you can see that manufacturing has dropped off entirely. Services have grown, and other goods. There's still some manufacturing going on up there, and you'll see in Kitchener-Waterloo there's a tech industry, so they still have other things going for them. But poor old Bruce Peninsula, Stratford, Bruce, and then the Peninsula. It's Grey Bruce, right? Okay, we're talking about Grey Bruce and Stratford. Their manufacturing has dropped right off, and the service industry is trying to take over, but it's not doing a very good job. Next. So what's happened, of course, then, since the year 2000, is that in Ontario, the temporary employment has really outstripped permanent employment by a huge margin. We have lost, I think, 300,000 jobs in Ontario, good solid jobs in Ontario since the year 2000. Now the federal government says that they're making up those jobs and they're creating jobs, but they're all part-time, temporary, short-term contract, self-employed, precarious work. I think the figure is something like 95% of the jobs that were created in Canada in 2013 were precarious work jobs. All right, did we finish the last slide?
Yeah.
I should also mention that we're not very competitive either. There's an economic index called the World Economic Forum Global Competitive Index. Canada has slipped to 15th place on that. And the US, believe it or not, has actually risen 2 places. We're not doing very well. Our economy is not doing all that great. Now, precarious work helps to drive inequality. We've seen how inequality in Canada has increased over the past 20 years. That's from the late 2000s. Since 1990, the lower and middle income groups have lost a share of the national income. This precarious work, which we've been talking about, drives inequality, and inequality itself. Next one, I guess. You just did it? Okay, inequality itself, we can go back. Sorry, leave it there. All right, we'll go back. Yeah, it doesn't matter. The inequality in Canada is growing at a faster rate than we like to think. We're here, and as you can see, this is where we were in 1981, and inequality has grown this much for us, about the same as Australia, wherever Australia is here. It's growing at a much faster rate in the US and the United Kingdom, but it's still growing in Canada. Okay, let's go to wherever we were. All right. And these, of course, are the problems with inequality. The higher the rate of inequality, the more problems you have in society. And you'll see that in Grey Bruce we have, I believe, twice the rate of obesity, not heaviness, but obesity in Grey Bruce than they do in the rest of Ontario. But all of these things, life expectancy, math, literacy, infant mortality, homicides, imprisonment, teenage birth, trust, obesity, mental illness, and trust. Trust goes down as inequality rises. So this is income inequality, and this is the incidence or the index of health and social problems. So the pigs it's a terrible name in Europe, as Portugal, Italy, Greece. They're in dire straits, and their inequality is quite large, even though there are austerity programs being enforced by the European Common Market. And you will find that they have a relatively high rate of these problems. Norway, Sweden, ironically Japan, Denmark, Netherlands, they're in much better shape in terms of those problems. So we're middle of the pack, but I think that the inequality in Canada, according to And these are not fly-by-night organizations that are coming up with these figures. This is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. This is the Conference Board of Canada. These are all figures from them. This is the result of a study that's being done, continues to be done in the UK by Wilkinson and Pickett, called The Spirit Level. There's a book out by it, and there's a really strong correlation between inequality and social problems. And it doesn't really matter how much wealth you have. You will hear the phrase, we have more wealth in this country than we ever have before. And maybe that's true. But it's not the degree of wealth, it's the degree of inequality that causes the problems. Trust is a big loser. There was a recent study out of the US that very strongly correlated trust with inequality. In other words, the best predictor of lack of trust, interpersonal trust, and confidence in institutions was the degree of inequality. And I think we mentioned, and I think it's true as well, that one of the reasons we do not have a robust turnouts, robust democracy, is because of the inequality. Not so much the cynicism, the inequality. Okay, on that one. The next one, see what happens. So you probably already know. That's all right. This is a really interesting chart. It's U.S. figures, that's true, but it turns up in Robert Reich, who is a really terrific economist in the United States. He was the Labor Secretary under Clinton and resigned from Clinton's cabinet because he didn't like the direction in which the policies were going. But in his movie or documentary called Inequality for All, which you can find on Netflix, there's this graph. And this graph is absolutely central to understanding a lot of stuff that's going on in society. We have the same graph, okay? This is US, yes, but our inequality dipped. But it wasn't quite so deep, and the rise back to inequality for Canada was a lot gentler. So we have kind of gentler inequality, but we still have it. Now, this is the years, of course, 1920 all the way up to 2010, and this measures inequality by the share of national income earned by the top 1%. There are a number of ways of measuring inequality. That's not the best one. The best one is something called the Gini coefficient, and I won't get into the details, but I think there's a couple of graphs around the graph about inequality in Canada. Use the Gini coefficient. And the Gini coefficient is simply a statistical relationship between differences in distributions. Anyway, but this is not a bad measure. And what we find here, this is very, very interesting because, of course, back in 29 was the stock market crash. It did, but it did not go down any further. It didn't go down until FDR and Canada, by the way, began to introduce a New Deal into society, and they freed up the unions. The unions were much freer to organize and get members. 1940s, 1950s, there's a little bit of a dip where the Second World War was. And during the golden age of capitalism, we see that we have the least inequality in the US and in Canada. So this is where the madmen made their money, right? Now, in 1979, it began to go up, and it began to go up, and this is not me saying this is Robert Reich and a number of other economists. When Ronald Reagan came to be president, he did a number of things. First of all, he broke the Air Controllers Union and broke a number of unions as well, and he began to deregulate industry. So you get more deregulation. So inequality is going back up. In 1990s, you have the Clinton era. And one of the things that Bill Clinton did was repeal something called the Glass-Steagall Act. The Glass-Steagall Act was introduced by FDR's administration back in the 30s. And what it did was simply separate the money that banks could use for making their own profit from their shareholders or from their account holders. That separation was gone once the Glass-Steagall Act, and you can draw a straight line between that government regulation, or rather deregulation. You can draw a straight line between that deregulation and the 2008 crisis, financial crisis. So after 2008, the inequality is still rising, and there are some good economic analyses out explaining why that's happening. So all the things that we've been talking about today have those kinds of roots. Okay. Next one. Local symptoms and grave roots. Okay, so now we know a little bit of why this is happening on a global scale. But we see the results of precarious work and inequality locally. I'm sure you know some of these figures, and I'm sure you've been talking about them. And Deidre put a lot of figures on the table about Hamilton. It's the same story. We have twice the rate of visits to the ER, and if you go on the public health website, you'll find a great little page called Let's Have a Conversation About Health, and a short video that links precarious work to injury. High rates, and in fact, I should just back up. When I was doing the cafe conversations in Owen Sound, well not Owen Sound, but in Wyerton and a couple of other places, I talked to a fellow who had been working for, I think he said, 30 years at the quarries in Wyerton. Now, if you know the quarries in Wyerton, that's a tough job. It's seasonal, you know, there's no union, a little bit of money, no benefits, or hardly any benefits. And he was in hospital, he had been hospitalized for serious injuries 11 times in that 30 years. So sure, there's disability, and we're going to get to this too. Yeah, there's disability, but that's a public cost. Yeah, there's hospital, but that's a public cost as well. So what some companies are doing, what they're doing is they're really offloading their personnel costs onto the public purse. Now, I don't know whether, can you go back a couple of slides? I don't know whether I missed it or not. Yeah, hold on here. This is the economic costs of inequality. And one of the things that's happening, we haven't got any figures, I haven't seen any figures for Canada yet. But one of the things that's happening that's very clear in the US is that companies are offloading their costs onto the public purse. We have a government-paid public health system here, and we have food banks. And so the cost of precarious work is not as clear here as it is in the United States, where everything is monetized. So what happens is that if McDonald's is not paying its employees enough to make a living wage, then they have to go on to Medicaid or Medicare if they get ill, or they have to go onto food stamps in order to get food, because as somebody pointed out, can't even really afford to buy McDonald's food. The fast food industry in the United States costs the public taxpayer $7 billion a year in its employees going onto Medicare and having to use food stamps. And in fact, there used to be a McResources line that hard-pressed employees could phone up and they would get some advice from the corporation about how to get to the end of the month. And the thing that they told them was how to apply for food stamps and how to apply for Medicare. Walmart alone, according to some economic analyses, costs the American taxpayer something like over $5,000 a year per employee, because they don't pay their members, they don't pay their employees enough to get to the end of the month as well, and so they've got to go on the food stamps and they've got to get Medicare, and that puts the costs on the public purse. It's no surprise, perhaps, that Walmart has one of the biggest share of using, or of food stamp business of all of the food suppliers. So you go to Walmart with your food stamps and get food. 18% of their business comes from food stamps. So it is an absolute untruth that large corporations such as McDonald's and Tim Hortons and Walmart cannot pay their employees enough to get to the end of the month. They can. There's lots of economic analyses that show that they can. And if you go to Australia, the minimum wage in Australia is 16 bucks an hour. A Big Mac in Australia will cost you maybe 40 cents more. You can't tell me that McDonald's can't pay their employees a little bit more money to get to the end of the month. Other economists have crunched some other numbers, and they say that if all of the big box stores, Walmart, Canadian Tire, Costco, raise the price of a basket of goods, I think it's something like 13 cents. So that every time you go, when you buy a basket of goods, it's going to cost you 13 cents more. And they put that money back into their employee wages. They could raise 1.5 million people in the US alone out of poverty. So it's not just government that needs to be aware of what's going on. And it's not, poverty task force people or healthcare people or social services people that need to, and the Ontario Works people that need to know what's going on. It's also business. I think that they have a responsibility to step up to the plate here. I don't care, I would love to make the kind of profits that they do. I'd love to make the kind of wages that a CEO gets. I don't care about their profits, and I don't care about the wages that the CEO makes. What I care about is their employees. And what I care about is when industry begins to offload its operating expenses on the public purse. Okay, so we were back to a local Bruce County. Pardon me? I have to wrap up? Okay. All right, I'll wrap up after this slide. So it all comes down, can you go back to the Bruce County? It all comes down to the kinds of things that we're seeing, and all of the things that I've talked about come home to roost in this community. High rates of obesity, high rates of usage of food banks, $40,000 a month is what the food banks hand out here in Owen Sound. Long waiting lists for housing. I've talked to physicians who see these people, precarious work folks, in their offices all the time. There's a doctor down in St. Mike's who prescribes money. So when people come in to his office, he knows very well what's going on. And what he does is sit them down with people in his office that he has hired that helps them get onto disability or social assistance or whatever it is in order to get more money in their pockets. There are reports of wage theft, injury time, and high stress in Owen Sound. 20% of families in Owen Sound are below the poverty line cutoff. 41% of lone parent families are making half the minimum income for survival. Okay, well, I'll just quickly go through a couple more here. You already know what the living wage is here, as calculated by the United Way. Evidences. There is good economic evidence that increases in the minimum wage actually reduce unemployment. There is evidence out of the States again that higher wages will stabilize the workforce. We'll talk about that. This I think I'll just skip through. I wanted to show some of the shapes of things. If you want more details, you can get to it. But this one I want to stop just very quickly. Okay, well, this is the suspension bridge, or the dip in equality and inequality that we talked about earlier. This is union membership. And I'm showing you this because it's absolutely falsity to start to blame unions for bringing down business or shooing business away. During the golden age of capitalism, union membership was at its highs. It's an absolutely positive, absolutely negative correlation. The more union participation you have in the economy, the less inequality you have in society. Okay. This one. Again, out of the US, because they simply have done more work than we have. But you can see here as a positive correlation. And what's a positive correlation? Well, the positive correlation between inequality and lack of trust in government. This is the polarization of government, of both parties in the US. And you can see that when inequality is low, there's also low cynicism, low polarization and maximum trust. When inequality is high, polarization and lack of trust is also high. Okay, we're at key references, but I just wanted to, I understand I have to wrap up pretty quickly, but what I wanted to do was to urge the Poverty Task Force, now that you've got new councils and mayors in place, I'd like to urge you to make a full court press on these new councils and mayors before they get to looking at the budgets. Because what happens when they look at the budgets, they're going to start looking at the bottom line. And if the bottom line is not great, the first place that councils or any government likes to, the first thing they like to do is to cut wages and salaries. You cut wages, you cut salaries, you have more people in precarious work, you have less money floating around in your local economy, and you have greater mistrust and greater inequality. It's a mug's game to cut wages and salary and staff and the government level. Yes?
David, I had one question, and it kind of confused me a bit, because you said Canada and Australia were relatively neck and neck in terms of inequality.
I was saying that the rate of inequality is rising the same in Australia.
But Australia has a livable minimum wage, and Ontario is 11. Is there a correlation there at all, or?
That's a good question. I don't know. I haven't seen the stats. I haven't seen the analysis, so I don't know. Any other questions?
What is something, we talked a little bit about municipal responsibility versus the province versus federal. Where do you see the municipal responsibility around living wage issues?
I see the municipal responsibility in terms of the leadership it can provide. If you pay employees, especially in places like Grey and Bruce, where there's not a lot of good jobs around, look, the best way to get good jobs is to get good industry, okay? Good, well-paying jobs back into the area. The chambers of commerce around here, they have some good ideas about how to do that, including planning economic development on a regional basis. Chambers of commerce and the councils have got to start working together on that. But in the meantime, that's a long-term goal, and there are lots of things that both councils and chambers of commerce can do. But in the meantime, you cannot take money out of people's pocket, especially in a place like Owen Sound, where there's not a lot of money going around. So the best thing that municipal councils could do would be to make sure that they have a living wage policy, and that they pay their employees a living wage, which in this area is roughly $15 an hour. And they make sure that if you're going to contract services out, that those contractors also pay their people a minimum or a living wage. It's not just New Westminster has a living wage policy, and it obliges its contractors to pay a living wage. I think Toronto has a fair wage policy. LA is looking at a living wage policy as well. Seattle has not only a living wage policy for employees and contractors, but a living wage policy for the private sector as well. So they've passed city ordinances that oblige the private sector, hoteliers, fast food joints, to pay a living wage. So it can start at the municipal level.